The Scottish Borders has many stories of ghostly happenings and supernatural events, and the bulk of these tend to be connected with historical buildings which have a bloody and violent past. In this short talk, we're going to examine the ghostly happenings in two well-known border castles. The first place we're going to visit is famed in border story, for Branksome Castle has seen more than its fair share of bloodshed and daring do. Built on a high bank above the River Teviot, south of Hawick, this ancient estate was originally owned by the Commons, Lovells and Douglases before being handed to the Scott clan in 1420, and it's remained in their hands until the present day. All the legends that are associated with it are linked to famous members of that great reaving family. Branksome was destroyed by English raiding parties on at least 4 occasions. In 1514, 1532, 1544 and 1570, and on each occasion was replaced with a bigger and stronger structure. Wicked Wat, first of Branksome and third of Buccleuch, was one of many colourful characters to have lived in the castle. The veteran of many border feuds, he was knighted on the field at the Battle of Flodden in 1513, where he lost many of his kinsmen. In 1524, young James V of Scotland asked for Wat's help to free him from the grip of the Douglas clan, led by Archibald Douglas, the Earl of Angus. So Wat and 600 men intercepted the king's train, which included the Kerrs of Ferniehirst and Cessford, but were defeated by Douglas's men at what became known as the Battle of Melrose. As Wat was driven back, one of his men killed Kerr of Cessford. This led to a bloody feud between the Scots and the Kerrs, which culminated in Wat's murder in October 1552, when he was attacked by a band of Kerrs as he walked through the High Street in Edinburgh. John Hume of Colden Knowes ran him through with his sword before Walter Kerr avenged his father's death and finished him off, stealing his cloak and bonnet as he lay slumped against a market stall. Wat's third wife, Janet Beaton, became more famous than her husband. A fiercely determined woman, she took the law into her own hands 5 years after his death, when she pursued Sir Peter Cranston, whom she thought was involved in it, to the kirk of St Mary of the Lowes in Yarrow. St Peter took sanctuary in the kirk and barred the door behind him, but Janet lifted an axe and broke the door down before setting fire to the building. A few years later, she had an affair with a man who was even more controversial than her late husband, James Hepburn, the 4th Earl of Bothwell, who became Mary Queen of Scots' third husband. A bit of a catch where the ladies were concerned, he was described as being the hunkiest Scotsman and was both gorgeous and manly. He must have been a toy boy because he was only 24 at the time, while she was in her early 40s, but still had an unfading beauty and a youthful appearance. It's said that her appearance was not down to oil of Ulay, but something more sinister: witchcraft. It's also said that Janet used witchcraft to bring about the death of Lord Darnley, Mary Queen of Scots' second husband, and to coerce Mary into agreeing to it. It's hardly surprising, then, that she was the inspiration for the Wizard Lady of Branksome in Sir Walter Scott, The Lay of the Last Minstrel, with its opening lines: "The feast was over in Branksome Tower, and the lady had gone to her secret bower, her bower that was guarded by word and by spell, deadly to hear and deadly to tell." It's said that the ghost, the White Lady of Branksome, is in fact Janet Scott. This misty figure has been seen making its way across the fields from the River Teviot before crossing the A7. It then passes through a small door that once existed in a fence at the roadside before climbing the bank and disappearing into the castle. Branksome's other ghost is of a man who is seen near the Bloody Burn behind the castle's steading. The name Bloody Burn is said to be derived from the fact that this burn once ran red with blood after one of the times when Branksome was attacked. When discussing border ghost stories, it would be impossible to leave this grim and god-forsaken place out. For Hermitage Castle, which was once described as the embodiment of the phrase "sod off" in stone, is claimed to be one of the most haunted castles in Scotland. Over the centuries, many terrifying and bloody acts have been committed within its walls. It is therefore not surprising that quite a number of different entities are said to haunt the castle and its grounds. The castle was built as a motte and bailey fortress in the 1240s by the Norman knight Nicholas de Soulis. However, in 1320 it was seized by the king from his descendant and passed to Sir William Douglas, the Knight of Liddesdale. It stayed with the Douglases until 1492, when it passed to Patrick Hepburn, the first Earl of Bothwell. The Bothwells held the castle until 1594, before James VI passed it on to Sir Walter Scott, the Bold Buccleuch. With the Union of the Crowns in 1603, it became obsolete and fell into disrepair. And by the turn of the 18th century, it was in ruins. In 1930, the Buccleuch family handed it over to the nation, and it is now looked after by Historic Scotland. In 1820, some repairs were carried out to the castle by the 5th Duke of Buccleuch. One of his masons broke down a wall and discovered a sealed-up dungeon barely 8 feet square, where a skeleton lay crumbling next to the remains of a saddle, a large bridle bit, and a rusting sword. It is thought that these were the remains of Sir Alexander Ramsay of Dalhousie, the Sheriff of Teviotdale. Sir Alexander had incurred the wrath of Sir William Douglas when he recaptured Roxburgh Castle off the English in 1342, something that Sir William had tried unsuccessfully to do. Furthermore, he was made governor of the castle and the Sheriff of Teviotdale as a reward for this brave feat. Sir William was not a happy bunny, and pounced on Ramsay as he held court in St Mary's Kirk in Hawick. Ramsay, not suspecting his old comrade, invited Douglas to sit next to him. But the furious baron drew his sword and attacked and wounded his victim, and then threw him bleeding across a horse before taking him to Hermitage, where he imprisoned him and left him to starve in a frightful pit or dungeon, apparently airless and devoid of any sanitation. It's said that he survived for 17 days without food or water, by eating the few grains of corn that fell through the gaps in the floor from the granary above. They also say that his apparition has been seen wandering around the ruins, and that his blood-curdling screams are still heard echoing out over this bleak valley at night. Another ghost that's seen at Hermitage is of a lady dressed in white, which some say is the ghost of Mary Queen of Scots. However, to be fair, there are few ancient ruins in Scotland which don't claim to have a ghost of Mary Queen of Scots. When she arrived to visit Bothwell in 1566, after he was attacked by little Jock Elliot of the park, she only stayed with him for a couple of hours. She was still married to Lord Darnley at the time, and quite rightly would have worried that tongues would have started to wag if her slippers had been found under his bed the next morning. Like his lover, Bothwell met a particularly grisly end. After the Battle of Carberry Hill, he fled to Norway, where he was arrested and finally imprisoned in Dragsam Castle in Denmark. He was held under appalling conditions. For the last 10 years of his life, he was chained to a pillar in a tiny space that was barely big enough to stand up in. He eventually died in April 1578, an insane and broken man. His tortured soul is said to still haunt Hermitage Castle. Another entity that allegedly haunts the castle is of one of its earliest inhabitants, William de Soulis. It seems that this de Soulis, known locally as the Dark Lord Soulis, was, to put it mildly, a bit of a psychotic thug. Legend portrays him as a huge and physically powerful man who cruelly treated all around him. Stories began to circulate that he practiced the black arts, kidnapping local children and using their blood in dark rituals held within the castle. During these rituals, he would summon up his familiar, Robin Redcap, which normally lived in a stout chest in the castle's dungeon. A redcap powrie or dunter was a type of evil goblin which was said to haunt ruined castles along the borders of Scotland and England. They would attack and kill anyone who crossed their path before soaking their red cap in the victim's blood. This had to be done regularly, for if the stains on their hat dried, the red cap would die. William de Soulis was not your perfect host. His candlelit suppers were about as notorious as hyacinth bouquets. He would lure his victims into the castle and then slaughter them. The giant known as the Coot of Kielder was one famous victim of the Dark Lord. He and his men were invited to dine at the castle and were then promptly massacred. However, the Coot wore a magic suit of armour that no weapon could pierce, and being young and strong was able to fight his way out of the castle. However, when crossing the Hermitage River, he stumbled and fell in, and was held under the water with lances until he drowned. His grave on the bank near this drowning pool can still be seen today. But as the saying goes, what goes around comes around, and the locals became heartily sick of the Dark Lord's dastardly deeds. So they petitioned King Robert the Bruce, who was so tired of hearing complaints about him that he rashly said, "Boil him if you please, but let me hear no more of him." So they took him at his word, and that is exactly what they did. They suspended a large cauldron from the stones on the 9-stane rig nearby, lit a roaring fire beneath it, and as the ballad tells, made Lord Soulis the first ever hog roast in the Borders. They rolled him up in a sheet of lead for a funeral pall. They plunged him into the cauldron red and melted him, lead and bones and all. The king, on realising what he'd sanctioned, quickly dispatched riders to stop the killing, but they were too late. By the time they arrived, de Soulis was burnt to a crisp. That's one version of how Lord Soulis met his end. In the other, which is probably more correct, he entered into a conspiracy with other noblemen to dethrone Robert the Bruce and take the crown for himself. But the Countess of Strathearn discovered the plot, and de Soulis was seized at Berwick. In 1320, he and his co-conspirators were tried in front of the Scottish Parliament, and many were executed. However, the king spared de Soulis, but his lands were confiscated, and he spent the rest of his days imprisoned in Dumbarton Castle, where he died. I know which version of the story I prefer, and why let the truth get in the way of a good story. Whichever version of the tale you choose to accept, if you do visit Hermitage, whatever you do, don't visit this grim and evil place on a cold, dark winter's night.